Hello, Brubs. We're buried alive. The terrifying history of our most primal fear by Jan, 2001 book, published by Norton. Look at the hand trying to come out. Oh, look, and there he is. All right. Chapter 8's a long one. It's probably going to take over an hour to read this chapter. Chapter 8 Skeptical Physiologists and Raving Spiritualists. To die is natural, but the living death of those who waken into consciousness, though for a moment only, or less, to find the coffin stifling their last breath, surpasses every horror underneath the sun of heaven, and should surely check haste in the living to remove the wreck of what was just before the soul's fierce sheath. How many have been smothered in their shroud? How many have sustained this awful woe? Humanity should shudder, could we know. How many cried to God in anguish loud, accusing those whose haste a wrong had wrought, beyond the worst that ever devil thought. Percy Russell, Premature Burial, from Burial Reformer Magazine, 1906. By the early 19th century, the danger of premature burial had become one of the most feared perils of everyday life, and a torrent of pamphlets and academic theses were dedicated to this subject by writers all over Europe. In almost every country, a literature on this gruesome topic was readily available, ranging from the solemn medical thesis. The hell was that? And the philanthropic call for more waiting mortuaries, to pamphlets written by fanatics who claimed that more than 1/10 of humanity was buried alive, and to horror-mongering compilations of bugaboo stories like that of the notorious Coppin. The British nation had managed to resist the continental obsession with premature burial in the late 18th century, but in the 1810s the French pamphlets invaded the British Isles, provoking a good deal of magazine writing on the subject. A Swiss lady awakes in her coffin, as it is drawn in the author's collection. Osler Peter Boat, 1822. Moreover, the British reading public did not have to rely wholly on the importation from Germany and France of alternately silly or sadistic stories on prematurely buried people being saved from the tomb or dying amid hideous torments. In 1816, the book The Danger of Premature Interment by Joseph Taylor of Newington Butts appeared in London. This imaginative Englishman had previously written on apparitions and ghosts, canine gratitude, and anecdotes of remarkable insight. His diligence in making odd reports of apparently dead people's coming to life was commendable, more so than his judgment and comment on them. The original Lady tale was, of course, reproduced in his collection, as well as a rather amusing English variation on the same theme, said to have involved Sir Hugh Ackland of Devonshire, or is it Devonshire? This worthy had died of a fever, it seemed, and two footmen sat up with the corpse, which was laid out in a coffin. One of them, remembering that his late master dearly loved brandy when he was alive, poured a glass of brandy down the corpse's throat. Sir Hugh immediately responded to treatment and came stuttering to life. He survived for several years, and the impudent footman received a handsome annuity. 3 years after Taylor's book was published, the British public was again reminded of the continental debate about premature burial. In a book on various aspects of death, the Reverend Walter Whiter claimed that people were regularly buried alive by mistake, not only in Germany and France, but also in the heart of Britain. He had read the English edition of Bruyère And he also recounted the tale of a German lady who woke up from her attack of Scheintod with the most pitiable shriek as the lid of her coffin was to be nailed down. Whiter believed that the warm earth possessed remarkable powers to restore life. Indeed, he recommended that earth baths be employed as a means of revivification in cases of death trance. This state of affairs only further increased the danger of awakening in the tomb, Whiter wrote. The warm, genial earth possesses, I believe, many or mighty virtues for assisting the resuscitative process, and I grievously fear that the examples of revival in the grave are more frequent than the world, amidst all their alarms existing on premature internment, has yet ventured to conceive. If Taylor's and Whiter's books were relatively balanced, John Snart's Thesaurus of Horror, or the Charnel House Explored, was probably the most ludicrous and gruesome book ever to appear in its particular literary genre. I must get that book. Snart was a writer on mathematics, about whom little is known, except that he was very frightened of being buried alive. The nature of the book's contents can be easily gleaned from the following deplorable poem introducing its main theme. But if the fertilizing earth restore the dubious fragment of a borrowed life, can man's most desperate scuffle force the grave, or must he, grappling, bathe himself in blood and burst his eyeballs in the vain attempt? Snart claimed death in a natural way as the common lot of all mortals, from which none can escape, but this horrid supplement of supernumerary woe is a second death, extrinsic of that originally intended and far surpassing it in misery. He also detailed the tragic fate of Baron Hornstein, a popular courtier in Bavaria, who had been buried with great ceremony after his sudden demise from apoplexy at an early age. 2 days after the funeral, the workmen entered the mausoleum. When they witnessed an object which petrified them with horror, at the door of the sepulchre lay a body covered with blood. It was the mortal remains of the favorite of courts and princes. The baron had been buried alive. On recovering from his trance, he had forced the lock of his coffin and endeavored to escape from the charnel house. It was impossible. He therefore, in a fit of desperation, had dashed his brains out against the wall. The royal family, and indeed the whole city, are plunged in grief at the horrid catastrophe. To dash one's brains out against the wall, a gesture much favored by desperate villains in French novels, would require neck muscles of a prize bull and a skull the thickness of a china bowl. Such features would have made the baron an interesting spectacle already when alive. John Snart had read about what he called the Turkish test of death, which involved blowing air down the corpse's throat by means of a hog's bladder, with a tube attached to its orifice. The idea was that the relaxation of the sphincters after death would render it easier for the air to pass through the digestive tract. The sight, smell, and sound of this ludicrous procedure must have been disgusting in the extreme. Snart was convinced that this method was infallible, however, and recommended it for general use to prevent premature burials. The British Library's copy of Snart's book has a letter by Nariah Snart, the author's daughter, pasted into it. This letter contains Miss Snart's solemn promise before God and Jesus Christ that her father would never to be buried alive and that she would make sure that the Turkish test was carried out with a satisfactory result before he was put into his coffin. John Snart was anti-Catholic, but he also despised the Jews and their religion. His book is full of violent assaults on the Jews for their deleterious habit of early burials, and drawing a parallel to the barbarous practice of burying people before they are dead, Snart looked to the animal kingdom. If asp or basilisk or noxious weed distilling mortal venom through its frame, the more their fatal, sudden, more their more their aid to snatch me from this horrid fate I crave. Tarantulas and rattlesnakes attend. And hard mouth alligators come and dine, for though ye paralyze and rend the frame, ye have not learned to bury men alive. Snart's passionate description of the horrors of the untimely tomb deserves to be quoted at length, as an interesting expression of the deepest and the most unreasonable fear of a live burial. Behold the hapless victim of this horrid custom, upon the return of life, shut in the clay, cold prison. He lifts, ah no, his trembling hand to cure him, relied relief he feels so much the need of, and though before feeble by disease, and though feeble grown, Jesus Christ, I can't read, and though before grown feeble by disease, made desperate now by the maddening sense of this hapless situation and lost estate, but yet the attempt is stopped. The coffin is shut forever, screwed down, loaded with unrelenting earth. Terror, despair, horror, torments, unknown beliefs seize on him, madness, rage, all, no power to live, no power to die, no power at last to cry for aid, but pent, barricaded, and pressed by accumulating condensation, the brain distracted, the eyes starting from their sockets, the lungs ruptured, the heart rent asunder by unnatural impulses, the ducts and glands suffused, the emunctories choked by surcharge of feces, tendered viscid by incoalescence and external resistance, and every vein and artery bursting in the superhuman conflict. The office of inosculation, baffled, tries in vain to force its valves and runs retrograde, bathes the poor grappling victim in extravasated blood without, and forms new channels within in this dreadful scuffle, which knows no cessation or abatement, till coagulation's influence stagnates and deprives him of all thought, and he becomes a fermentable mass of murdered, senseless, decomposing matter. He was the first Goth. With such alarmist pamphlets on the market, it is not surprising that some English people, usually from the upper classes of society, left legacies to their family physicians to protect themselves against this gruesome fate. The antiquary Francis Douce of 200 guineas to the surgeon Sir Anthony Carlyle to see to that his heart was taken out after death, and his friend Mr. Carrick did the same, with the added safeguard that his own son was to supervise the procedure. Mr. Burton, another antiquary, wished his coffin to be filled with quicklime to render resurrection impossible. There are quite a few examples of Britons taking similar precautions, ranging from the sensible to delay burial for 3 or 4 days after death, to the most gruesome mutilations worthier of a butcher's yard and mortuary. Lady Dryden of Northamptonshire left an eminent physician £50 to make sure her throat was cut before burial, and the doctor performed the task. Mrs. Elizabeth Thomas of Islington directed that her physician pierce her heart with a long metal pin, and again the doctor performed the post-mortem operation. The writer Harriet Martineau left her doctor 10 guineas to see to it that her head was amputated. Mr. William Shackwell of Plymouth in Devon requested that all his fingers and toes be amputated to ensure that he was really dead. A more frequent and much more sensible precaution was to request that the jugular vein be cut before burial, as did the poet Edmund Yates and the actress Ada Cavendish, among many others. Bishop Berkeley, the novelist Lord Lytton, and the poet Daniel O'Connell also dreaded premature burial and put precautions in their wills to escape this fate. And Lady Burton, wife of the explorer Sir Richard, ordered in her will that after death her heart be pierced with a needle and her body then dissected and embalmed. Still, the popular fear of premature burial never reached the same heights in Britain as it did in Germany and France, except during cholera epidemics, particularly the one in 1831 to 32. In January 1832, there were claims that a laborer in Haddington had been buried alive. The wretched man had swept the grave clothes away from him, but the brutal attendants had nailed down the coffin lid anyway. On investigation, the doctor in charge said that the man had probably had a muscular spasm post mortem, as was sometimes observed in cholera cases. In Sunderland, preposterous rumors of people being buried alive were also widely spread. The ignorant populace believed that the doctors in charge were getting rid of troublesome patients by drugging them with laudanum and sending them off to the churchyard in a coffin, or that they were so fearful of disease that they deliberately killed their patients in order not to catch cholera themselves. There was even a rumor that the doctors were actually paid for each corpse they could deliver to the churchyards, and that some unscrupulous medical men added to this income by murdering a few patients by having them buried alive. Sounds actually just like a doctor. The same distrust of authorities is reflected in the following newspaper account headed Singular Scene at Lowborough. An old woman had died at the local workhouse, but some children thought they could hear her groan in her grave. A crowd of garrulous workhouse women arrived, and they believed they heard groans and felt that the earth shake from the prematurely buried woman's desperate efforts to escape her confinement. They started digging frenziedly with whatever implements they could find. More than 2,000 people gathered, and one of the women stood on a tombstone to deliver a harangue on the wickedness of the workhouse officers who had deliberately buried the old woman alive to get rid of her. A furious chimney sweep's wife put her fists in the sexton's face and loaded him with almost every epithet in the genteel vocabulary. But when the coffin was finally opened, the corpse was found to be undisturbed, ice cold, and very dead. It is instructive that these incidents involve distrust of authorities rather than actual fear of an accidental live burial. In the 1820s and 1830s, when the enthusiasm for anti premature burial philanthropy was beginning to wane in Germany, the concern for the helpless, apparently dead people, and the fear of premature burial gathered new strength in France. On December 13th, 1834, M. Hyacinthe Leguerne read a memorial before the Chamber of Deputies in Paris, demanding that waiting mortuaries be erected in every major city. The deputies took no action. M. Leguerne then published a horrid pamphlet entitled Rosalind, ou les Mysteries de la Tombe, allegedly based on a true story. A young lady, Rosalind Dabb, described as young, beautiful, and embodying every female virtue, died and was duly buried. 2 months later, her heartbroken fiance was desperate to see her one final time. Deaf to the argument that her corpse was unlikely to be a particularly attractive sight, he clandestinely went into the graveyard in the evening and dug up Rosalind's coffin with the help of an aged domestic. He was horror struck when he saw that the coffin lid was shattered and that a fleshless hand had been thrust through the gash in the lid. Rosaline had been buried alive. In such a fearful extremity, one would have expected an excitable young Frenchman to go mad, tear his hair, and embrace the coffin, shaking his convulsively clenched fist toward the sky, and cursing God in a shrill voice that reverberated from the nearby tombstones. But Rosaline's fiance did nothing of the sort. He went home, drank a glass of toddy, and wrote a long letter to Rosaline's physician, calmly stating that the careless medical man had, by his fatal error, condemned his young patient to the most horrible death that could be imagined. The magnanimous young man forgave the doctor, but urged him to take better care in the future and not bury any more of his patients alive. He ended his lengthy missive by recounting a number of famous historical cases of premature burial, quoted from the works of Bruyere and other authorities. M. Leguerne was a stalwart propagandist, active throughout the 1840s with his distasteful distasteful pamphlets. Although he was never able to surpass his first lugubrious masterpiece, he did not lack readers among his countrymen, and in 1844 he published the sixth edition of his Danger Day Inhumations Precipites. He was seconded by Madame Hortense Dufay, a lady philanthropist and busybody, who wrote pamphlets against immorality, drunkenness, and the danger of gypsies and vagabonds stealing children. She had strong views on the subject and claimed that she had once herself been falsely diagnosed as dead by a physician. Her solution to the problem was that all corpses be kept above ground for 7 or 8 days before burial, and that, as an extra safeguard, their arms, legs, and heads be chopped off before they were put in their coffins. Hyacinthe Legurn's appeal in 1834 caught the notice of the physician and chemist Jean Sebastian Eugene Ulia de Fontenelle. How many damn pages do I have to go here? A lot of pages. There's no way this chapter is this long. Yeah, it is. 182. They met, and Julia de Fontenelle was treated to a private reading of Rosaline. Whether the dreadful pathos of this tale moved him to complete his own treatise on the subject of apparent death and premature burial is not known, but it did not take him long to publish his Recherches médico-légales sur l'incertitude des signes de la mort. Julia de Fontenelle was a respected physician and a knowledgeable scientist, though one given to flights of fancy, and his book was to become the most influential French work of its kind for quite a number of years. But this was due more to Julia de Fontenelle's reputation than to any merits his work possessed. In fact, there was little difference in outline or in reasoning between his book and those written by Bruyère almost 100 years earlier. Indeed, Julia de Fontenelle gave Bruyère a handsome éloge for his judicious observations, which had by no means been refuted by Louis' attack. He fully agreed with Bruyère that putrefaction was the only certain sign of death. The 57 cases of premature burial or narrow escapes in his book contained many old favorites. Archbishop Guerin, Cardinal Andreas, the 2 young lovers, the lady with the ring, and several incarnations of the careless anatomist. The modern cases added little that was credible. A certain Dr. Fossati told the story of a man buried in a vault underneath a church in Italy. An ominous murmuring noise emanated from the vault, but when the churchgoers told the priest in charge, the learned clerics replied that it was probably the soul of the dead man saying its prayers. After 2 days, it was decided to open the vault. The spectacle they encountered was so gruesome that the doctor who had wrongly declared the man dead himself died of grief shortly thereafter. Another modern case of a soldier who had died in the 1832 cholera epidemic, but revived in the coffin and gave a cry as it was lowered into the grave, would have claims of credibility had it not been vouched for by the notoriously unreliable M. Leguerne, the author of Rosaline. In 1833, Julia de Fontenelle had traveled in Germany to study the waiting mortuaries there, and his suggested solution to the problem of premature burials was to start an ambitious building program for these hospitals for the dead all over France. In France, Julia de Fontenelle's book was praised by reviewers as a work of both science and philanthropy, but in Britain it received a harsh welcome. In a scathing review, the London physician Robert Ferguson made fun of the French nation's collective fear of premature burial. He wrote that in France, many people, especially women, were so haunted by this dreadful fate that they almost feared to go to sleep, lest they should wake up with a coffin for their bed and 6 feet of earth for their covering. Far from trying to calm these exaggerated fears, French physicians like Julia de Fontenelle actually produced books and pamphlets that helped deepen the horror of the grave. In Britain, these terrorists boasted no educated disciples, and the popular fear of premature burial had not caught on, as in Germany and France. Much of the blame for the French preoccupation with premature burial rested with the unscrupulous newspaper editors, who multiplied the cases of alleged premature burial to an extent that would have been frightful had the cases not been refuted by their very number. Dr. Ferguson wrote that while an English country editor, in want of a paragraph, might invent a tale of a bird of passage being shot out of season, or an apple tree blossoming in October, the French neighbors demanded stronger and spicier tales, and premature burial was a perennial favorite with editors and readers alike. Julia de Fontenelle had been musing that the number of Frenchmen annually buried alive was so great that the military power of his country had to suffer, but Dr. Ferguson was unconvinced. Making fun of Julia de Fontenelle's attempts to recruit the population from the graveyards, he wrote that if the practice of premature burial had been as common as the French author had surmised, the priest's requisite in pace during evening mass would have been answered by a loud chorus of Amen from the surrounding graves. Turning to Julia de Fontenelle's cases, Dr. Ferguson found much to criticize. Enough of a scholar to see through the old tales of the two young lovers and the lady with the ring, he wrote that if the Frenchman had been as well read in English literature, he could have added Romeo and Juliet to his list of pleasant stories. Another case involved a French officer who woke up from a death trance on the dissection table. He made his resurrection known with the words, "I perceive the action has been hot." Equally ludicrous was the tale of an apparently dead abbé who was carried to the churchyard in his coffin. For some reason, his cat had been put in the coffin with him, and the animal made such a caterwauling in there that the pallbearers stopped to see what was happening. When the lid was opened, out jumped the cat, closely followed by the abbé, who ran off as fast as his legs could carry him. Dr. Ferguson wrote that even a person of moderate intellect would immediately perceive that both these stories had been intended as jokes rather than as medical case reports. Dr. Ferguson's demolition of Julia de Fontenelle's arguments is not only amusing reading, but also highlights the contrasting attitudes toward apparent death and premature burial in Germany, France, and Britain in the 1830s and 1840s. As we saw, the Germans were by this time beginning to doubt the value of their precious Leichenhauser. The bulk of medical opinion still favored the construction of such hospitals for the dead, but both the clergy and the educated middle classes no longer shared this view, to say nothing of the common people. In France, which had no waiting mortuaries, there was, on the other hand, widespread popular agitation for these safeguards against premature burial. And many people were convinced that premature burials were common and that everyone was at risk. Indeed, the intensive production of French pamphlets and medical works on this subject resembled that of Germany in the 1790s. In Britain, the books of Joseph Taylor and John Snart had entirely failed to whip up a similar mass agitation for burial reform, and the medical profession shared Dr. Ferguson's attitude of amused incredulity at these distasteful foreign excesses. In the early 19th century, the British people were more concerned with another problem concerning their dead, or maybe not so dead, fellow beings, the practice of robbing graves to steal corpses for the anatomy schools. Instead of inventing security coffins that safeguarded against a premature burial, British inventors patented steel or concrete coverings for the tombs that grave robbers could not penetrate. Among the other devices used to ward off the body snatchers were spiked railings around the tombs, or even craftily hidden traps or buried spring guns. If a German philanthropist visiting Britain would have been alerted by stifled cries for help emanating from a recently filled in grave, he might have learned the hard way that concerns for the dead take different forms in different cultures. His frantically digging hand would have been caught in the jaws of the hidden steel trap or torn by the blast from a powerful shotgun. In the 1840s, the French preoccupation with apparent death and premature burial continued unabated. The production of unwholesome books and pamphlets on the subject exceeded all precedents, and the situation resembled that in Germany after Hufeland's appeal in 1790. Many people put clauses in their wills to safeguard themselves against an awakening in the coffin. The famous composer Frederick Chopin feared premature burial, and before his death in 1849, requested in his will that his body be dissected after death. His fellow composer Giacomo Meyerbeer and King Leopold I of Belgium made similar requests. The irony that many Germans had now got tired of their precious Leichenhauser was lost on the earnest French propagandist whose expansive plans for waiting mortuaries in every town and major village would have upset the civic finances considerably. In 1843, the country practitioner Dr. Léonce Lenormand published a pamphlet to support the erection of a waiting mortuary in his hometown of Macon. He excelled in detailed descriptions of the torments of awakening inside the coffin, interspersed with the familiar tales of the lady with the ring, the two young lovers, and the careless anatomist. The latter, bogeyman, appeared in a novel guise. He started to dissect a Belgian soldier whom he presumed to be dead, but the soldier revived and attacked him fiercely. The anatomist prevailed after a furious fight when the soldier fainted from loss of blood. Another horrific tale, similarly lacking in verification, featured a nobleman from Florence, Prince L., who was declared dead after a lethargic illness. His body was later found lying on the floor of the family vault, where he had died of hunger. He had awakened from the clutches of death, only to find another death, one that was 1,000 times more horrible. Leormand's amazing cases, including one avowedly taken from a scientific journal published in London. In 1831, a young Englishman died of typhus fever in France and was buried in a common grave in the churchyard. On the fourth day after burial, an anatomist and his helpers dug up the body to dissect it in their laboratory, but after an incision had been made in the breast, the Englishman gave a cry and grasped the professor's arm. He had survived burial alive for 4 days and wrote a lengthy, sentimental account of his sufferings in the tomb, containing exclamations like, "Each stroke of the hammer made my whole frame tremble. Oh, if I could only have cried out, or even given a sigh." But no, the literary quality of the writing somehow suggests that this story was not meant to be quite factual, and that the case report was intended as a horror story in a popular magazine. In the 1840s, the number of French newspaper reports of people being buried alive was greater than ever. It has been recorded that several French newspapers, including the influential Le Siècle, Moniteur, Constitutionnel, and La Patrie, were actively supporting the anti-premature burial movement, and that they were publishing every instance of alleged burial before death they could lay their hands on, without investigating its veracity or lack of it. In 1844, King Louis Philippe's government set up a commission to investigate the truth or falsehood of these rumors and to plan funerary reform if it turned out to be true that French people were frequently buried alive. Dr. Jules Antoine Josset was appointed to travel to Germany to study the waiting mortuaries there. Dr. Josset was a thorough, if not particularly brilliant, medical scientist, and he took his assignment very seriously indeed. He made a lengthy tour of the waiting mortuaries in Germany. In 1854, after 10 years of study, he put the fruits of his researches before the Academy of Sciences in Paris, hoping to receive one of the prizes. Dr. Josset disagreed with Bouchet's proposal of the heartbeat as a certain sign of death. He claimed that colleagues of his had treated two cases of apparent death, an infant and a woman who had taken poison, were there where there was no audible heartbeat. In light of those two cases, the usefulness of Bouchet's treatise could indeed be questioned. Maybe the glowing praise the Academy had bestowed on him would prove just as premature as many a burial performed according to Bouchet's good guidelines, not good lines. Dr. Joseph was aware that many diseases, such as syncope, apoplexy, cerebral commotion, drowning, hysteria, and narcotic poisoning, could result in a state of apparent death. He condemned all traditional signs of death as uncertain putrefaction. Uncertain. Putrefaction had to be awaited. He had to admit that it reduced the impact of the many newspaper rumors about premature burials, that out of more than 46,000 corpses taken into the German waiting mortuaries, not a single one had revived. But in France, where 800,000 people died annually, there could not be too many precautions to protect the helpless, apparently dead from the horrible fate that awaited them. Our old friend M. Leguerne had given Joseph a list of 46 French cases of premature burial that had occurred in 12 years, and although he elsewhere demonstrated a healthy mistrust of the arguments of the anti premature burial activist, Dr. Joseph was for some reason greatly impressed with this figure. He proposed that in addition to obligatory certification of death by a doctor in all of France, and a 24-hour delay between death and burial, waiting mortuaries like that in Frankfurt were needed all over the country. He ended his book by claiming that all his many years of hard work and numerous sacrifices would have been worthwhile if he could remove the formidable scourge known as premature burial from the people of France. It is apparent that he was also very keen to receive a prize from the Academy of Sciences. However, for the front page of his book proudly carries the inscription Couronne par l'Institut, but the optimistic doctor had probably added this inscription. Before the prize committee had actually met, he received only an honorary mention and an encouragement of 1,000 francs, and the committee took great exception to his expansive and unrealistic building program for waiting mortuaries. Even an English reviewer was impressed with the thoroughness of Dr. Joseph's work, although he deplored that sanitary police, at least in England, is indifferent about the risk of a few burials alive and thinks it superfluous to prevent their occurrence. In 1866, the French anti premature burial campaigners presented another appeal for burial reform before the Senate of the Second Empire. It had been devised by Madame Dufay and M. de Carnot and was supported by several influential politicians. They demanded that the time between declaration of death and burial should be extended from 24 to 48 hours, and that waiting mortuaries with equipment for electrical resuscitation of corpses should be built in that town. Two distinguished senators, M. Tourangeau and the Vicomte de Barral, took part in the debate, recounting some horrific newspaper stories about gnawed fingers, bloody shrouds, and convulsively clenched fists full of human hair to try to curdle the senator's blood. A distinguished prelate, Cardinal Archbishop Donnet, then stood up to speak. He claimed that he had saved the lives of two people presumed dead. He first recounted the tale of a woman who had recovered from her trance when her coffin was carried to the cemetery to be buried. This was mild stuff compared with the grand Guignol scenes conjured up by the Vicomte. How the hell you say that word? Vicomte? Vicomte? But what was to come was more impressive. The cardinal spoke about a young priest who had collapsed in the pulpit while delivering a sermon. Taken out of the church and carried home, the priest could neither see nor move a muscle. But he could still hear, and what he heard was not apt to reassure him. After the doctor came and pronounced him dead, He could hear the funeral bell tolling. The venerable bishop, in whose cathedral the young priest had been preaching, came to recite the De Profundis. His body was measured for a coffin, and the next day his friends came around to see him for the last time before his coffin was carried away. But when the young priest heard the voice of an old friend he had known from infancy, he made a superhuman effort to speak and succeeded in making his resuscitation known to the bystanders. Standers, not standards. He recovered so quickly that a day later he again stood in the pulpit. Before some incredulous senator could intercede with the demand that this case be formally proven, or that he was not impressed by this histrionic priest's swooning away, the dignified cardinal continued, "The young priest, gentlemen, is the same man who is now speaking before you." In the stunned silence that ensued, he urged them to learn by the example he had put before them that diagnosis of death by a doctor was still fallible, and that burial reform was needed to avert the most fearful and irreparable of misfortunes. The Senate rejected the proposition, however. Another appeal in 1869, in which Cardinal Donnet again took part, had as little effect, although the debate was lengthy and the newspaper coverage extensive. Regarding the 1866 and 1869 appeals, none less than Charles Dickens commented that the French arguments were founded more on sentiments than on facts. There had been no case of apparent death in the German waiting mortuaries, and people were becoming unwilling to deposit their dead there. Although new proposals for burial reform were submitted under the Second Republic in 1879, 1880, and 1883, they lacked support and were easily brushed aside. By this time, the old premature burial stalwarts like Hyacinthe Leguerne, Hortense Dufay, and Léonce Lenormand were either dead or getting old, and the movement had difficulties recruiting replacements who possessed the same monomaniacal energy and unflagging interest in preventing premature internments. Furthermore, very few medical men were by this time on the side of the anti premature burial movement. Eugene Bouchet worked for 30 years to undermine the public fear of premature burial. Already in the 1849 edition of his book, he had disproved some of the old silly idle rumors peddled in the French activist pamphlets. For example, he discovered that the careless anatomist stories about Vesalius, Philippe Pugh, and the doctor of the abbey, Prevost, were without factual foundation. He also elegantly disposed of 4 newspaper tales from one of M. Leguerne's lugubrious volumes. He had written to the mayors or town clerks in the cities involved to ask for verification, and the stories all turned out to be completely false. For instance, an account in the influential La Presse of December 12th, 1846, had confidently stated that a man had knocked inside his coffin in the town of Cluny. Seon et lueur. When his coffin was opened, he leapt up and ran away, jumping over the cemetery wall. The mayor of Cluny replied that the factual basis for this story was that the named man had died of pleurisy and that the doctor in charge had prudently waited 8 hours before declaring him dead. This had started the rumor, which grew steadily while working its way toward the big national newspapers. On November 29th, 1867, Le Figaro contained another dramatic resurrection story, which again proved utterly untrue. The local authorities wrote to Dr. Bouchet that the individual in question had died more than a year earlier, without any untoward incident. In the 1883 edition of his book, Bouchet doubted the existence of contemporary premature burial altogether. It was just a newspaper myth, and he recommended that all doctors investigate and disprove alleged cases. Other French skeptics, including the influential professor Paul Breurdel, followed his example. After 20 years of investigation, Brewerdahl could conclude that not a single newspaper report of live burial could be verified from the relevant local authorities. In many instances, he suspected that unscrupulous journalists had themselves invented their stories or fetched them from old newspapers. In 1862, the Dutch professor Alexander van Hasselt published the first German language book that flatly contradicted Hufeland's doctrine of the Scheintod. Premature burials, he wrote, were not common, and the signs of death, as described by Dr. Bouchet and other proponents of modern medicine, were perfectly reliable. He did not go as far as the German Georges Varentrap and the Frenchman Gaultier de Clobry and deny the occurrences of premature burials altogether, but he was confident that they were very rare. Let's take a look at this. What is this? A man has awakened from his death trance in the lichen house of Kekskamet and stands up in his coffin to embrace the startled watchman. A drawing alleged to be based on a real event from the Illustraties Wiener Extrabiat of March 18th, 1899. Let's get a look at that, bruv. He's choking him. You fucking buried me, bruv. Look, he smashed through the... he broke through the coffin, too, and got his ass. I'll fucking kill you, bruv. While active in Utrecht, I don't know how to say that city, for 24 years, he had not come across a single case, nor had Dr. Joseph, after a similarly lengthy period at the Paris morgue, encountered any instance of live burial. Professor von Hasselt was also aware of the role of the French newspaper propagandists in the opposition to premature burial and could demonstrate that their untrue stories spread from newspaper to newspaper, even reaching respectable medical publications. In 1851, he had been interested to see a case of premature burial from his hometown of Utrecht. Quoted in a French medical pamphlet, a prematurely buried cholera victim had made his resuscitation known too late and was found soaked in blood in the coffin. He had eaten 3 of his fingers in his agony. Wonder why they always claim that these people buried alive ate their fingers. Why the fuck would you eat your fingers if you were trying to get out of a coffin? The source was the respectable medical journal Gazette des Hôpitaux, but this periodical had reproduced it from a Dutch newspaper. The Camper Courant, inquiring into the circumstances at the relevant hospital and cemetery, von Hasselt found the story to be completely untrue. Similarly, the German professor Goppert had investigated the series of newspaper accounts of alleged premature burials in Rhine-Hessen. All were complete inventions, except one, which had only concerned a corpse that had been warm longer than usual in the local mortuary. In 1867, a Danish doctor could demonstrate that 4 out of 5 local tales of apparent death and premature burial reported in the Dagbladet, is it Dagbladet or Dagbladet, newspaper were total fabrications. A series of French articles published in 1880 gives an interesting insight into how these popular tales of premature burial originated and how they spread through folklore and the newspaper media. A certain Dr. P. Caravel wrote that he had once been called in to examine the contents of 3 coffins in a morgue. After a workman said he had heard knocking, all 3 corpses turned out to be putrid, but it did not take many days before the entire town knew that one of the municipal councillors, whose remains had been in one of the coffins, had been buried alive. Nor was this tale repudiated by the local newspapers. Dr. Caravel wrote a denial, but was unable to convince people of the truth. La Mort Vivante, a young girl awakens after being declared dead. An illustration from Le Petit Journal, 1902. Let's look at her. She looks pretty damn good for a dead person. He cynically had to conclude that his patients, who were busy gossiping that one of the local worthies had been prematurely buried because of his neglect, trusted the newspapers more than their doctors. Dr. A. Job, or Job, whichever, of Lunaville, had had an even more dismal experience. A patient of his had died from tuberculosis at the age of 26. In the evening of the next day, he was called by the mayor's son. White faced and distraught, this gentleman told the doctor that while digging another grave, the verger had heard a sinister knocking sound from the man's recently buried coffin. The coffin was, of course, exhumed, and the doctor sent for it once. After a long, cold ride through heavy snow, Dr. Job arrived at the churchyard where 12 people were solemnly standing around the man's grave. The local schoolmaster, who also claimed to have heard the knocking, was telling everyone that the man had been buried alive. But when the coffin was opened, the corpse was ice cold and still, and there were no signs whatsoever of an awakening in the tomb. Dr. Job presumed that the knocking sound was the result of the swelling of the coffin boards. The verger stubbornly shook his head when told this, and before long all of Lunaville knew that their doctor had buried one of his patients alive. A certain Dr. E. Decane, I believe it's Decane, I don't know how to say it, Decane, had also fallen afoul of the unreasonable obsession with premature burial that reigned in France at this time. When an elderly lady who lived with her sister in a large chateau died, Dr. Decane was called in to examine the body. Her sister, refusing to believe that she was really dead, urged that the lifeless body be stimulated in some way. Although the doctor found this distasteful, he took a red hot poker and burned the corpse over the face. The old woman then flew at him like a maniac, screaming that he had disfigured her sister. Only after Dr. Decane had sworn a solemn oath on the Bible that the woman was really dead could her sister be persuaded to let go of the corpse and to allow it to be shrouded and coffined. Why wouldn't you burn like the arm or something? Several years later, a workman came to Dr. Decane and urged him to cut his recently dead wife's head off before she was buried. When the doctor wished to know the reason for this strange request, the workman said that many local people knew that one of the doctor's other patients, the old lady at the chateau, had been buried alive. It was told that the daughter of Henry Lawrence, the first president of the American Continental Congress during the Revolutionary War, was declared dead of smallpox when quite young, was shrouded and coffined, but awoke from her trance, recovered, and lived to a mature age. This narrow escape made such an impression on her father that he lived in fear of a premature interment and directed in his will that his body be cremated. Another American worthy, General Robert E. Lee, had similar concerns also. It was claimed brought on by a tragic occurrence in his close family. His mother was prone to seizures and was declared dead by a physician after one of her fits. But when the sexton was filling in the grave, Mrs. Lee recovered, knocked on the coffin lid, and gave a loud cry. She was rescued in time. Still, the European fear of premature burial took quite a while to reach the United States. The books of Taylor and Snart were not published in America, nor were there any American translations of the numerous French and German pamphlets on the subject. Early 19th century American medical science was much influenced by the British tradition and thus escaped Hufeland's doctrine on the Shinetot. Although the 1820s and 1830s American medical articles on the diagnosis of death agreed that putrefaction was the most certain sign of death, the other signs were not considered worthless if used with caution. The diffusion of the fear of premature burial into American society thus occurred not through medical science but through popular books and magazines. Edgar Allan Poe had no difficulties in procuring material for his study on the subject. Blackwood's magazine delighted in publishing stories about premature burials, as did the appositely named Casket and several other American newspapers and magazines. Both The Lady with the Ring and The Two Young Lovers appear in several guises, along with the usual bugaboo tales of gnawed fingers, bloody shrouds, and horribly contorted bodies found inside coffins. In 1847, the first appeal to build waiting mortuaries on American soil appeared after an article reproduced in the New York Observer and several other papers had praised the German mortuaries for their sterling work for the prevention of premature burials. The appeal was unsuccessful, although it ended with these stirring words: "To awake from what may seem the sweet sleep of returning health, and find oneself not only dressed in the habiliments of the grave, but enclosed within its remorseless grasp, to feel the sickening pang which the first realization of this horrible fact produces, to struggle when no hope cheers the effort, to hear perhaps the hum of life as it rolls over our heads and from which we are cut off forever, to call out when no air can be reached, and finally give up and wish to die, but cannot be released. The idea is replete with horror, and the risk should never be permitted." Come on. In 1871, a more serious appeal was launched by Dr. Alexander Wilder, who read an address on the perils of premature burial before the New York State Assembly. He told some of the usual horror stories of corpses found in unnatural positions and demanded a change in the legislation so that no person could be buried without being certified dead by a competent physician. Wilder was a proponent of eclectic medicine, which encompassed all kinds of dubious and murky theories on herbalism, self-healing, and homeopathy. He rejected the bacterial origin of disease, preferring the time-honored dogma that disease was due to overexposure to cold, sexual excesses, unwholesome postures in bed, or mental overexcitement. Wilder was an anti-vaccinationist, kind of anti-vaccinationist, thus denying the merits of one of the greatest medical breakthroughs available at his time. He was also a spiritualist, and many of his friends in this movement shared his fear of being prematurely buried, since they believed that the spirit could leave the body at will to go and gad about on its own. They found it precarious, to say the least, that the spirit might have to return to a body that had been declared dead from lack of an occupant, shrouded and buried under 6 feet of earth. From the 1870s on, the anti-premature burial movement in Britain and the United States was to recruit a fair proportion of its members from the spiritualists. One of Alexander Wilder's followers in the eclectic medical movement was Dr. Moore Russell Fletcher of Boston. In 1883, he published a book entitled Our Home Doctor, which combined a guide to family health with his pet theories on herbalism and homeopathy. In between sections on delirium tremens, tapeworms, and ingrown toenails, we find a discussion on whether alcoholic liquors, sexual excitement, or superabundance of bile is the most frequent cause of disease, as well as the information that the Africans missed the train of evolution and thus remain the same as they were thousands of years ago. After 332 pages of this nonsense, we reach the piece de resistance. The book also contains a pamphlet entitled 1,000 People Buried Alive by Their Best Friend. Human beings could enter a state of hibernation just like snakes or toads, Dr. Fletcher wrote, and this made them liable to enter a state of trance deep enough to be mistaken for death. In fact, his own Aunt Nancy had been buried alive. The old European legends of premature burial are not spicy enough for Dr. Fletcher, who actually improved on them. We learned that Andrew Vassal deliberately murdered his own patient by stabbing him in his still beating heart to cover up his fatal error of declaring him dead. The wicked anatomist then fled to Asia. The Lady with the Ring story is placed at Toulouse in 1866 and ends fatally for the robber. Dr. Fletcher later edifies the reader with a few American case reports. In New Orleans, new case reports, with a few American case reports called from the newspaper columns. In May 1869, a young lady in New Orleans was certified dead by her own uncle, a physician, after she suddenly fell ill. She was buried in a vault that same afternoon, but the sexton's son heard the most dreadful sounds from the vault and called his father. When her parents arrived at the cemetery, no sounds were coming from the vault. After it was opened, it was seen that the girl had struggled fearfully. Her hands were clenched and bore marks of teeth. Her hair was torn from her head, and her face was terribly distorted. The horror of the parents and of the physician and uncle cannot be described. Equally pleasant was the tale of Mrs. Crane, the wife of a bookkeeper who died, or so it was thought, in 1868. Her mother grieved her death bitterly, and the sorrow was believed to have affected her reason. One day she came rushing into her son in law's room, screaming, "You have buried my daughter alive. What shall I do?" To allay her fears, the tomb was opened, but the sight that awaited the wretched mother was not a prepossessing one. There was blood everywhere. The glass pane in the coffin lid was broken. The corpse's fingers were bitten and cut by glass, and the hair almost entirely torn out of the head. After this shock, Mrs. Crane's mother herself fell dangerously ill, and her life was feared for. Much of the American anti premature burial agitation was centered in New Jersey and Massachusetts. Alexander Wilder was active in Newark, and Moore Russell Fletcher in Boston. The editors of a magazine entitled Our Dumb Animals, published in the latter city, were concerned both about for dogs, for poor dogs. We're concerned both about for poor dogs tortured by cruel vivisectors and about apparently dead people at risk of being buried alive. The spiritualist, anti-vivisectionist, anti-vaccinationist, and homeopathic communities in this part of America were closely linked, and many of their members also agitated against premature burials. In 1889, the singular death of one of their leading members led to immense outrage throughout these communities. Washington Irving Bishop, the famous spiritualist and mind reader, had collapsed after one of his shows in New York and been pronounced dead by a doctor the following night. He was suffering from some kind of cataleptic condition, and it was said that he always carried a note saying that if he was considered dead, his body should be kept in a safe, warm place, and his own doctor be sent for. Under no conditions should it be autopsied. When Bishop's wife went to the Hawks funeral parlor on 6th Avenue to see his lifeless body, she wanted the attendant to comb his hair, but as the man did so, he dropped the comb, which fell into the empty cranium. Bishop had been autopsied, and his brain was missing. Mrs. Bishop started screaming and accused the doctors in charge of having murdered her husband to get his brain, which was thought to be particularly developed as a result of his mind-reading talents. Bishop's mother, the eccentric spiritualist Eleanor Fletcher Bishop, also charged the doctors with murder for premature autopsy. At the inquest, a verdict of not guilty was returned against the 3 doctors involved, although one of them was reprimanded for the undue haste of the autopsy. Bishop's brain had actually been found inside the corpse's thoracic cavity. The outraged Eleanor Fletcher Bishop then published a pamphlet entitled Human Vivisection of Sir Washington Irving Bishop, illustrated with a portrait of herself embracing her son's lifeless body in its casket. She boldly accused the doctors of having murdered her son. Dr. Frank Ferguson, the Jack the Ripper of America, ripped my angel boy open and took out his heart and sawed his beautiful fair brow and head into 2 pieces, took out his wonderful brain, and then the butchery of my only child was accomplished. The Bishop case, often mentioned in American anti-premature burial agitation, caused much sensationalist press commentary. Alexander Wilder and his fellow activists all agreed that Bishop had been autopsied while still alive. In 1895, the occult publishing company in Boston brought out a book entitled Buried Alive by Dr. Franz Hartmann, MD. This deplorable volume contained a greater proportion of horrid stories than any previous work in the English language, outclassing even John Snart's Thesaurus of Horror. Hartmann was no ordinary doctor. He was a spiritualist and friend of Madame Blavatsky, a Freemason and a Rosicrucian co-founder of the Ordo Templi Ordinis Magical Society, an inventor of a bogus inhalation therapy for tuberculosis. A native of Austria, he had emigrated to the United States in the 1860s and served as a medical officer in the American Civil War. Later, he traveled around in the southern states practicing as an itinerant doctor, some would say quack, and for a time serving as coroner in Georgetown, Colorado. Many of Franz Hartmann's sanguinary case reports were culled from the pages of the similarly spirited work of Léonce Lenormand. Hartmann published 3 versions of The Lady with the Ring from Salzburg, Kronstadt, and Beaujolais, and 3 versions of The Two Young Lovers. The Austrian newspapers supplied further material. In a small town in the province of Styria, a young pregnant woman died and, after a wait of the customary 3 days, was buried in the local churchyard. Some days after the burial, it was rumored that her husband had poisoned her, and the grave was opened by order of the police. There was evidence of a terrible struggle, and the woman had given birth to a child in her coffin. The physician who had signed her certificate of death was sentenced to a few weeks of imprisonment in the hope that a period of incarceration would improve his diagnostic ability. Hartmann considered all signs of death as highly fallible. Since a spirit could leave the body and re-enter it at will, even putrefaction was uncertain, because he could reproduce some dubious German instances of corpses that emitted an insupportable odor but still came to life again. He had himself observed a Negro in Texas who emitted a terrible odor like a corpse in an advanced state of putrefaction. A correspondent of his, Mr. H.R. Phillips of 51 East 50th Street in New York, wrote that one of his friends, a sea captain, came home to find that his wife had died in his absence. He had the body exhumed, and from the position of the body grew convinced that she had been buried alive. As a result of this horrible experience, he became insane and was confined in an asylum. The wife's sisters, the clairvoyant Millie Fancher of Brooklyn, was affected even worse. She took to her bed and never rose from it again, living entirely on liquids for many years. Franz Hartmann's book was later reprinted in London, but with little success. Not a single copy seems to be kept in any British library. The London Society for the Prevention of Premature Burial bought a number of copies, but buyers were so scarce that they finally had to give the books away to newly recruited members. The reviewer of Hartmann's book in the British Medical Journal was scathing when he quoted one of the more fanciful case reports, actually culled from the pages of Léonce Lenormand. What is to be thought of the credibility of an author who gravely narrates the case of an Englishman who died of typhus fever in 1831, who was buried 4 days later, and after another 4 days of burial in a coffin in a grave, was exhumed and found alive, and who stated that he had been conscious all the time, and that his lungs had been paralyzed and used no air, and that his heart did not beat. The reviewer concluded bluntly, a worse farrago of nonsense than that contained in this pamphlet it has seldom been our lot to come across. And that's the end of chapter 90. 999. All right, that's it.